Why is it that help can come into a person's life and yet be missed completely? Why do some people pray for answers but fail to recognize them when they arrive? Why do opportunities pass? Not because they were absent, but because they were not recognized. There is a dimension of life many people ignore. Not every answer comes in the form you expect. Not every solution looks like a miracle. Not every help appears with announcement. Sometimes what you pray for arrives quietly, unnoticed, uncelebrated, unrecognized, and because it is not recognized, it is missed. This is where awareness becomes critical. Because life is not only about receiving, it is about recognizing. There are moments when help is present, but perception is absent. And when perception is absent, opportunity becomes invisible. This is why many people can stand in the middle of change and still feel stuck because what is available has not been discerned. Now think carefully. How many times has something entered your life that you did not take seriously at first? A connection, an idea, a moment, something small that later revealed itself to be significant. But at the time, it did not look important. And because it did not look important, it was ignored. This is one of the greatest dangers. Misinterpreting what is sent to help you, because help does not always look powerful. Sometimes it looks ordinary. Sometimes it looks inconvenient. Sometimes it looks unfamiliar. And because it does not match your expectation, you reject it. This is why discernment is not optional. It is necessary because without discernment, you may reject what was meant to move you forward. Now, there is another layer. Because not only can help be missed, it can also be resisted. Not intentionally, but subconsciously. You may resist what challenges your comfort. You may ignore what requires adjustment. You may avoid what demands change. And yet, those very things may carry your next level. Because growth rarely comes in a form that feels easy. It stretches you. It challenges you. It disrupts your routine. And if you are not prepared for that, you may mistake growth for inconvenience and walk away from it. This is why awareness must be paired with humility, because humility allows you to receive what you do not fully understand yet. It allows you to pause, observe, and consider. Instead of reacting immediately, instead of rejecting quickly, instead of dismissing prematurely, because once something is dismissed, it may not return the same way again. And this is where regret often begins. Not because nothing came, but because what came was not recognized. Now, here is something deeper. Because recognition is not only external, it is internal. Your mindset affects what you see. If your thinking is limited, your perception will be narrow. If your expectations are rigid, your recognition will be restricted. If your awareness is low, your opportunities will seem few. But when your awareness expands, you begin to see differently. You notice details others ignore. You recognize value where others see nothing. You respond to moments others miss. And this changes everything. Because life begins to open, not because more is coming, but because you are finally seeing what was already there. Now this brings us to a critical realization, because recognition is not automatic. It must be developed. You must train your awareness. You must sharpen your perception. You must learn to pause and evaluate instead of rushing to conclusion. Because not everything is what it appears to be at first glance. And not everything that looks small is insignificant. In fact, some of the most important shifts in life begin quietly, without attention, without noise, without announcement. And only those who are attentive recognize them. This is why attentiveness matters. Not distraction, not rushing, not constant reaction, but attentiveness. You begin to observe your life more carefully. You begin to notice patterns more clearly. You begin to pay attention to what is changing, because change is often subtle before it becomes visible. And if you miss it at the subtle stage, you may not recognize it later. Now, there is something else that must be addressed, because recognition alone is not enough. You must also respond, because seeing something does not change anything unless you act on it. You may recognize an opportunity, but if you do not engage it, it passes. You may discern a shift, but if you do not align with it, it fades. You may understand what needs to be done, but if you do not do it, nothing changes. And this is where responsibility begins, because awareness without action leads to frustration. You see what is possible, but you do not experience it. You understand what should happen, but it does not happen. And over time, this creates disappointment. Not because nothing is available, but because nothing is engaged. This is why action is necessary. No rush action, but intentional response. You move when you recognize. You align when you understand. You engage when you discern. And this is what turns awareness into transformation. Because transformation does not begin with knowledge, it begins with response. Now, this is the foundation. Because what you are about to understand next will require more than awareness. It will require alignment. Because it is not enough to recognize help, you must position yourself to receive it. Recognition alone is not what changes a life. Positioning does, because it is possible to see what is right and still not benefit from it. It is possible to understand what is available and still remain where you are. Why? Because being aware of something is not the same as being aligned with it. And this is where many people struggle. They begin to see more clearly. They begin to understand more deeply. But their position has not changed. And if your position does not change, your outcome rarely will. Now think about this carefully. You can recognize an opportunity, but if you are not in position to engage it, it passes. You can understand the direction, but if you are not aligned to move in it, you remain stagnant. You can desire change. But if your life is not structured for it, it never becomes reality. This is why positioning is critical, because positioning determines access, not desire, not intention, not even awareness alone, but positioning. Now, what does positioning really mean? It is not just where you are physically, it is how your life is arranged. It is how your thinking is structured. It is how your priorities are set. It is how your habits are formed. Because your position is built by your patterns, daily patterns, repeated decisions, consistent behaviors. And over time, these patterns create a position, a place from which you live, a structure that defines your outcomes. So if your patterns are misaligned, your position will be limited. And if your position is limited, your results will reflect it. This is why change requires adjustment, not just desire, but rearrangement. You must begin to shift things, your focus, your habits, your priorities, because what brought you here may not be what takes you forward. And this is where many hesitate, because adjustment requires letting go of comfort, letting go of familiarity, letting go of what feels easy, and stepping into something new, something uncertain, something that requires growth. But without adjustment, there is no repositioning. And without repositioning, there is no progress. Now, here is something deeper, because positioning is not only about moving forward, it is also about removing what blocks you. There are things in life that quietly hold you back, not always visible, but present. Distractions that drain your focus, habits that weaken your discipline, environments that limit your growth. And if these things remain, they affect your position, even if you are aware of what is right, even if you desire change. This is why removal is necessary. Not everything can stay. Not everything should remain. Some things must be released So that space can be created, because you cannot build something new on top of what is misaligned. You must clear it, and this clearing is not always easy, because sometimes what must be removed is what you are used to, but what you are used to is not always what is right. And this is where discipline becomes important, because discipline allows you to choose what is right, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it requires effort, even when it demands consistency. Now, positioning also involves readiness, because even when opportunity is present, if you are not ready, you cannot sustain it. And what you cannot sustain, you will eventually lose. This is why preparation matters. You must build capacity to handle more, capacity to manage growth, capacity to remain stable under pressure. Because growth without capacity creates instability, and instability leads to loss. So you prepare, you develop, you strengthen, not because something is guaranteed, but because you are getting ready for what is possible. Now, here is the key transition. Because once positioning begins, movement follows. Things begin to shift. Opportunities begin to align. Connections begin to appear, and progress becomes visible. Not suddenly, but gradually. And this is where consistency must remain. Because early movement can be deceptive. It can make you feel like everything is already secured. But early movement is only the beginning, not the end. And if you relax too soon, you may interrupt the process. This is why consistency matters. You continue, you remain steady, you keep aligning, because what you are building is not temporary. It is foundational, and foundations take time. Now, this leads to something critical, because positioning is not a one-time event. It is a continuous process. You must keep adjusting, keep refining, keep aligning, because life continues to change, and your position must evolve with it. If you remain static while everything around you changes, you become misaligned again. This is why awareness must continue, not only at the beginning, but throughout the journey. You remain attentive, you remain responsive, you remain intentional, and this keeps you aligned. But even with positioning, there is still something more, because alignment alone does not remove resistance. And this is where many people become confused. They think, I am doing the right things. Why is there still opposition? And the answer is simple, because not everything that resists you is visible. There are deeper layers, hidden influences, unseen pressures, things that do not show on the surface, but still affect your movement. And until you understand this, you may misinterpret your situation. You may think something is wrong with you, when in reality, there is something working against your progress. And this is what we must begin to expose next. Because if you do not understand resistance, you will fight the wrong battles. There is a point where doing the right things is not enough, because something unseen is still resisting you. You can be aligned, you can be disciplined, you can be consistent, and yet feel delayed. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because there is resistance you have not yet understood. And if you do not understand resistance, you will misinterpret your situation. You will begin to blame yourself for what is not entirely coming from you. You will begin to question your progress. Even when you are moving correctly, you will begin to lose confidence, when in reality, you are simply encountering opposition. This is why discernment is necessary. Because not all struggles are the same. Some struggles are internal. Others are external. Some are caused by habits. Others are sustained by patterns beyond what is immediately visible. And if you treat every problem the same way, you will apply the wrong solution. Now think about this. Why do certain patterns repeat even after you have made changes? Why do some delays persist? even when you are doing what is right? Why does progress sometimes feel blocked without a clear explanation? These are the kinds of questions that require deeper thinking. Because not every delay is natural. Not every resistance is ordinary. Some resistance is pattern. It is consistent. It follows cycles. It appears at specific moments, especially when progress is near. And if you observe carefully, you will begin to notice it. Moments when things are about to move forward and suddenly something interferes, something delays, something disrupts, something diverts your focus. And over time, this creates frustration because you feel close but never fully arrive. This is what makes pattern resistance dangerous. It is not random. It is strategic. It does not always stop you at the beginning. It waits until progress is near, and then it intervenes. Now, here is a deeper issue. Because many people fight symptoms instead of addressing patterns. They try to fix what is visible without understanding what is driving it. So they deal with the surface, but the root remains. And when the root remains, the pattern continues. This is why diagnosis matters. You must ask the right questions. Not just what is happening, but why does this keep happening? What is consistent about this pattern? When does it usually appear? What does it interrupt? Because patterns reveal intent. And once you understand the pattern, you begin to understand the resistance. Now, this does not mean everything is negative or mysterious. It means you must become aware of deeper layers. Because life is not always as simple as it appears. There are dynamics beneath the surface. There are influences that shape outcomes. And if you ignore them, you may struggle unnecessarily. Now, here is something important. Because resistance does not only come from outside, sometimes it is reinforced internally through doubt, through fear, through hesitation, through inconsistency. And these internal factors can strengthen external resistance. Because when you are uncertain, you slow down. When you hesitate, you delay your own movement. When you doubt, you weaken your direction. And this creates openings, not visible openings, but practical ones. Gaps in your consistency, breaks in your focus, interruption in your progress. And over time, these gaps accumulate. And when they accumulate, progress becomes unstable. This is why strength must be developed internally, not just physically or externally, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, because internal strength stabilizes external movement. It allows you to remain steady even when things are not perfect. It allows you to continue even when there is pressure. It allows you to stay aligned even when progress feels slow. Now, here is the key shift, because once you begin to understand resistance, you stop reacting emotionally. You start responding strategically. You become more observant, more intentional, more aware of what is happening around you. And instead of asking, why is this happening to me? You begin to ask, what is this trying to interrupt? Because resistance often reveals significance. It appears where something matters. It targets what is important. It interferes where there is potential. And this changes how you see your situation. Because instead of feeling discouraged, you begin to recognize value. You begin to understand that what is being resisted is worth protecting. Now, this awareness changes your approach. You become more deliberate. You strengthen your consistency. You reduce distractions. You guard your focus. Because you understand that movement must be protected. Not just initiated, but maintained. And this leads to something critical. Because once resistance is understood, it must be confronted, not ignored, not avoided, but addressed. And this requires a different level of engagement. because passive awareness is not enough. You must take action, intentional action, consistent action, focused action, because what is not confronted often continues. And this is where many people hesitate. They see the pattern, but they do not engage it directly. They hope it will disappear. They assume it will resolve itself. But patterns rarely stop on their own. They must be broken. And breaking a pattern requires clarity and persistence. You must be willing to stay consistent until the pattern loses its hold. Not for a moment, but over time. Now this is where the transition happens. Because once resistance is confronted, something begins to shift. Not always immediately, but progressively. And this shift opens the door to something new, because what was previously blocked begins to move. What was delayed begins to align. What felt restricted begins to expand. And this is where movement becomes visible. But before that movement fully manifests, there is something that must be activated, because awareness, positioning, and resistance prepare you, but they do not complete the process. There is still a dimension of engagement that must be activated. There is a moment in every serious pursuit of change where preparation is no longer enough. You have become aware, you have adjusted your position, you have identified resistance. But nothing truly shifts until something is activated, because understanding without activation remains potential. And potential, no matter how great, does not produce results until it is engaged. This is the difference between knowing and moving, between preparation and manifestation, between readiness and release. Now here is where many people stop. They gather knowledge. They become more aware. They even begin to change certain habits, but they never cross into activation. And so their lives improve slightly, but never transform deeply. Because activation requires participation, not passive agreement, but intentional engagement. Now, what does activation really look like? It is not noise. It is not performance. It is not emotion without direction. Activation is focused engagement. It is when your awareness, your intention, and your actions are aligned toward a specific outcome. You are no longer observing your situation. You are addressing it. You are no longer reacting. You are initiating. And this is where movement begins. Now think about this carefully. There are moments when action must become deliberate, when silence must give way to expression, when intention must become declaration, because what remains unexpressed often remains inactive. And this is where many people struggle. They hesitate to act decisively. They delay taking responsibility. They wait for perfect conditions, but perfect conditions rarely come. And waiting too long becomes another form of delay. This is why activation requires boldness. Not reckless action, but clear, intentional movement. You begin to act on what you understand. You begin to align your actions with your awareness. You begin to reinforce your direction through consistency, because activation is not a single moment. It is a pattern of engagement, repeated action, sustained focus, continuous alignment. Now here is something deeper, because activation must be specific. General effort produces general results, but specific action produces targeted outcomes. You must be clear about what you are addressing, clear about what you are building, clear about what you are removing, because clarity sharpens your engagement. It directs your energy, it focuses your attention, and without clarity, effort becomes scattered. And scattered effort rarely produces meaningful change. This is why intention matters. Not vague desire, but defined direction. You know what you are moving toward. You know what you are confronting. You know what you are releasing. And this clarity strengthens your actions. Now, there is another layer to activation, because activation must be sustained, not temporary, not occasional, not dependent on mood, but consistent, because inconsistency weakens momentum. You may start strong, but if you do not continue, progress slows. And when progress slows, doubt can return. This is why consistency is critical. You continue even when it feels repetitive. You stay aligned even when results are not immediate. You remain focused even when distractions appear. Because activation builds momentum over time, not instantly, but gradually. And once momentum builds, movement becomes easier. Now, here is the turning point. Because once activation becomes consistent, things begin to shift. Not always dramatically at first, but noticeably. Patterns begin to break. Opportunities begin to align. Progress begins to stabilize. And what once felt blocked begins to open. But here is something important to understand. Because activation does not eliminate resistance immediately. It exposes it. When you begin to move intentionally, you begin to see more clearly what has been opposing you. Not because it is new, but because you are now engaging it directly, and this clarity is necessary. Because you cannot overcome what you do not clearly see. So do not be discouraged if resistance becomes more visible. It is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of engagement. You are now confronting what was previously hidden. And this is progress. Now, this leads to something critical, because activation requires authority. Not authority in a distant sense, but personal responsibility. You take ownership of your direction. You stop waiting for others to change your situation. You stop depending on external validation. You begin to move with intention because you understand your responsibility, and this changes your mindset. You are no longer passive. You are engaged. You are no longer reactive. You are deliberate. You are no longer uncertain. You are focused. And this mindset shift is what sustains activation. Now, here is the key transition. Because activation opens the door, but it does not complete the journey. Once movement begins, something else is required. Because what starts must be maintained. What opens must be sustained. What begins to grow must be protected. And this is where many people face their next challenge. Because starting is one thing, but sustaining is another. Once something begins to move, the next challenge is not starting. It is sustaining, because beginnings can be exciting. They carry energy. They carry motivation. They carry a sense of change. But sustainability requires something deeper than excitement. It requires discipline. It requires structure. It requires consistency when the feeling is no longer strong. And this is where many people struggle. They start well, but they do not continue well. They move for a moment, but they do not maintain the movement. And over time, what began to grow begins to slow down. Not because it was not real, but because it was not sustained. This is why sustainability is essential. Because what you cannot sustain, you cannot keep. Now think about this carefully. How many times have you started something with full energy, but did not continue it? How many times did progress begin, but fade after a short time? How many moments of clarity were not followed by consistent action? This is not uncommon, but it reveals something important. Because consistency is what stabilizes progress, not intensity, not occasional effort, but repeated alignment, day after day, decision after decision, action after action. And over time, this repetition creates strength. Now, here is something deeper. Because sustainability is not only about what you do, it is about how your life is structured. If your structure does not support your growth, your progress will always be temporary. You need systems. You need routines. You need habits that reinforce your direction, because structure reduces reliance on emotion. You do not have to feel motivated every day if your structure carries you. And this is what mature growth looks like. Not emotional movement, but disciplined consistency. Now there is another challenge here, because as progress continues, distractions increase. Not always obvious distractions, but subtle ones. Things that seem harmless but slowly pull your focus away. Small compromises, minor delays, shifts in priority. And over time, these small changes accumulate. And when they accumulate, they weaken your alignment. This is why vigilance is necessary. Not fear-based vigilance, but intentional awareness. You must protect your direction. You must guard your focus. You must recognize when something is pulling you away before it becomes a pattern. Because patterns are formed through repetition. And if you allow the wrong repetition, it will reshape your direction. Now here is something critical. Because sustainability also requires boundaries. You must know what to allow and what to reject. Not everything deserves your time. Not everything deserves your attention. Not everything aligns with your direction. And if you try to accommodate everything, you will dilute your focus. And diluted focus leads to weakened progress. This is why clarity must remain. You stay aligned with what matters. You reduce what does not. You simplify your direction so that your energy remains focused. Now here is the deeper truth. Because sustainability is not just external. It is internal. Your mindset must remain stable. Your thinking must remain clear. Your awareness must remain active. Because if your internal state becomes unstable, your external progress will follow. This is why you must continue developing internally. You refine your thinking. You strengthen your discipline. You deepen your awareness. And this allows your progress to remain steady. Now there is one more layer, because sustainability will be tested. Not once, but repeatedly. There will be moments when things feel slower. Moments when results are not immediately visible. Moments when distractions feel stronger. Moments when fatigue appears. And in those moments, your consistency will be challenged. This is where true growth is proven. Not when everything is easy, but when continuation requires effort. Because anyone can move when it feels good, but maturity is revealed when you continue without immediate reward. Now this leads to a powerful realization, because sustainability creates stability, and stability creates trust. You begin to trust your process. You begin to trust your direction. You begin to trust your ability to continue. And this trust strengthens your movement, because doubt begins to decrease and clarity begins to increase. Now, this is where everything begins to align. Because once something is sustained, it begins to expand naturally, not forced expansion, but organic growth. What was small becomes stable. What was unstable becomes consistent. What was uncertain becomes clear. And this is where momentum builds. But even at this level, there is still one more thing. Because growth must not only be sustained, it must also evolve. There is a point where consistency alone is no longer enough, because what you have sustained must now evolve. You have learned how to stay steady. You have built discipline. You have protected your direction. But if everything remains the same, growth will eventually slow down, because stability without evolution becomes limitation. And this is a subtle trap, not failure, but stagnation at a higher level. You are no longer where you used to be, but you are no longer advancing either. You are maintaining, but not progressing. And if this is not recognized, it can quietly hold you in place. Now, this is where many people become comfortable, because stability feels safe. It feels controlled. It feels predictable. And after overcoming struggle, that safety can feel like success. But safety is not always growth. And predictability is not always progress, because growth requires movement. Not reckless movement, but intentional expansion. You must begin to stretch again. Not because something is wrong, but because something more is possible. Now, here is the challenge. Because evolution requires change, and change always demands adjustment. You cannot evolve while holding on to everything the same way. Something must shift again. Your thinking, your approach, your capacity, because what brought you to this level may not carry you to the next. And this is where awareness must increase again. You begin to evaluate your current position, not from frustration, but from clarity. You ask, what needs to grow? What needs to improve? What needs to be released? Because evolution is intentional. It does not happen automatically. You must participate in it. Now, here is something deeper. Because evolution often requires discomfort. Not the discomfort of struggle, but the discomfort of stretching. You are no longer dealing with the same challenges, but you are being invited into greater responsibility, greater capacity, greater awareness. And this can feel unfamiliar because it requires you to think differently, to act differently, to operate at a higher level. And if you resist that stretch, you may remain where you are. Not because you cannot grow, but because you chose not to. Now, this is where many hesitate, because evolution exposes new gaps, new areas that need development, new responsibilities that require attention, and this can feel overwhelming. But it is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of expansion. You are being shown what is next, not to discourage you, but to prepare you. Now, here is the key. Because evolution must be guided, not rushed, not forced, but intentional. You do not abandon what is working. You build on it, you refine it, you strengthen it, while gradually expanding your capacity. Because sustainable growth is layered. You add to what is stable. You develop what is already working, and over time, this creates expansion without collapse. Now there is another layer. Because as you evolve, your environment may need to change. Not necessarily physically, but relationally, mentally, structurally, because your environment influences your growth. If your environment remains limited, it can restrict your expansion. Even if you are ready internally, this is why alignment must continue externally. You must surround yourself with what supports your growth. Not what holds you back, not what keeps you comfortable, but what challenges you to move forward. Now here is something critical. Because evolution requires vision. You must see beyond where you are. You must understand where you are going. Because without vision, growth becomes directionless. You may be active, but not advancing. You may be busy, but not progressing. And this leads to frustration. Because effort without direction feels exhausting. This is why clarity must increase again. You define your next level. You understand your next step. You align your actions accordingly. And this gives your growth direction. Now here is the turning point. Because once evolution begins, you step into a different level of responsibility. Not just maintaining, but leading your own growth. You are no longer reacting to change, you are initiating it. You are no longer waiting for movement, you are creating it. And this is where true maturity is revealed. Not in how you respond to life, but in how you shape it. Now, this leads to the final stage. Because growth, sustainability, and evolution must all come together. And if they are not held together properly, imbalance can occur. And imbalance can undo progress. So the final question becomes, how do you hold everything together? and continue moving forward without losing what you have built. Everything now comes down to one question. How do you continue moving forward without losing what you have already built? Because by this point, you have gained awareness. You have repositioned your life. You have confronted resistance. You have activated movement. You have learned consistency. You have stepped into growth, but none of it matters. If it cannot be held together, this is where many journeys break. Not at the beginning, but at the point of progress. Because growth introduces complexity, more responsibility, more decisions, more pressure. And if these are not managed properly, what was built can begin to weaken. Not suddenly, but gradually. This is why integration is necessary. Everything must work together. Your awareness must guide your decisions. Your discipline must sustain your actions. Your clarity must direct your growth. Nothing can operate in isolation, because isolated strength cannot sustain long-term progress. Now here is something deeper, because balance is not automatic. It must be created. You must learn how to manage your energy, your time, your focus, because as life expands, demands increase. And if your structure does not adapt, you become overwhelmed. Not because you are incapable, but because you are unbalanced. This is why prioritization becomes critical. You must know what matters most. Not everything is equal. Not everything deserves the same attention. And if you treat everything the same, you will exhaust yourself. And exhaustion leads to inconsistency. This is why clarity must remain sharp. You focus on what aligns with your direction. You reduce what distracts. You simplify where necessary.